a church bell that rings, yet no sound is heard. Welcome to Voice Chronicles. I am your host, Hawthorne. Share in the comments where you're tuning in from. I love seeing it. Now, the mystery begins. It was a morning of no particular distinction in Flaxborough. Faint drizzle, a postman trudging with that air of heroic endurance peculiar to his profession, and a council workman prodding half-heartedly at the town's single roundabout bed of geraniums. Inside St. Swithin's Church, however, a more curious scene had unfolded. Though in characteristically modest Flaxborough fashion, no one noticed it at once. The verger, Mr. Peck, was the first. He had come in with his usual air of grievance against the draught in the porch, and was halfway down the nave when he paused, frowned, and craned upwards. The bell was silent. This was no remarkable thing in itself, since Wednesday mornings did not usually demand peals of joy or solemn tolls. What was unusual was that the great bell rope, dangling in its accustomed place, was knotted tightly to the base of the ladder, as though deliberately fastened. Peck, no stranger to petty vandalism from village boys, muttered in disapproval, bent to release the rope, and then saw the note. It had been pinned, absurdly carefully, to the cushion of the third pew from the front. Written in a small, cramped hand, it read. Peck stood blinking at this message, his lips forming a number of silent rehearsals of outrage. After a decent minute of such private indignation, he carried the scrap of paper towards the vestry, where Canon Parkington was preparing his sermon on the duty of moderation. The canon, though a mild and flustered man, had his own sense of ecclesiastical dignity, and when presented with a crude little note asserting ownership of his bell, he stiffened to surprising height. "Well now," he said, tapping it against his palm as though to test its insolence, "we cannot have this. No, certainly not." Within the hour, word had reached Mrs. Gloss, whose chief qualification for managing the Church Ladies' Guild was her genius for instantaneous dissemination of rumour. She declared to 3 different acquaintances in quick succession that bell thieves were abroad in Flaxborough, possibly connected to a cult of some sort. By the time she reached the grocer's shop, she had further refined her view into a certainty that the bell had already been melted down for armaments. Inspector Purbright, when informed by Sergeant Love of these escalating whispers, raised his eyebrows only slightly. He was not yet convinced that silence from a church bell was anything more than silence from a church bell, but the note, carefully folded and placed on his desk blotter, did exert a faint pull on his curiosity. Love, meanwhile, expressed himself in terms of practical outrage. "Well, sir, it's church property, isn't it? They've no business to go tying ropes and scribbling threats. If you ask me, it'll be one of those youths from the technical college. They're always up to mischief. Took a wheel off my bicycle last month." Purbright merely murmured something neutral, the faintest suggestion of amusement in his tone, and reached for the note once more. He studied the letters, their peculiarly tight spacing, the odd habit of crossing every T with an upward flick, as though the writer resented the effort of finality. "That's the sort of hand," he said at last, "that belongs to someone who finds letters more convenient than conversation." Love looked puzzled, which was the normal course of events. By midday, the town had made up its mind. The bell of St. Swithin's had been claimed by an unknown hand. Canon Parkington was affronted, Mrs. Gloss was indignant, and Purbright was simply thoughtful. The news that St. Swithin's bell had been silenced travelled through Flaxborough with the sort of momentum usually reserved for a royal death, or the discovery of a second hairdresser in the same street. By the time Inspector Purbright had walked the short distance from the station to the police canteen for his luncheon, the event had grown from a verger's mild complaint into a full-fledged community scandal. The canteen itself provided an excellent vantage point for gauging the public temperature. Though intended for police use, it attracted a steady flow of municipal clerks, tradesmen, and ladies of indeterminate status who considered a plate of shepherd's pie under official auspices a kind of civic duty. It was here, with a plate of unenthusiastically browned fish, that Purbright found himself listening to the rising tide of interpretation. At the far end of the room, a pair of corporation men in overalls solemnly debated whether the bell had been nicked for scrap. One held that bell metal fetched a tidy sum from certain dealers who operated on the quiet. The other, less certain of metallurgy but firm in suspicion of outsiders, was convinced it had been spirited away in the night by gypsies. Mrs. Gloss, who had insinuated herself into the canteen by virtue of volunteering as a catering adviser, bustled between tables, ladle in hand, and relayed the story with minor embellishments. By now she was certain that the note was a direct threat to Canon Parkington's authority, and that a schism in the Church of England was inevitable unless immediate measures were taken. "It's the nonconformists," she whispered darkly to a fellow conspirator at the teapot. "Mark me, this is their way of telling us the true worshippers are elsewhere. A symbolic act, you see." Purbright, seated with Sergeant Love, spooned his fish in silence, while his subordinate offered a running commentary. "It's vandalism dressed up as a joke, sir. I'll lay money on it. Probably one of those students from the technical college. They've been known to borrow dustbins for races and set fire to old furniture in the recreation ground. A bell rope would be just the thing for them, and the note— Well, sir, I can't help thinking it's a prankster's sense of humour." Purbright dabbed his mouth politely before replying. "Possibly, but a prank sergeant usually sets out to amuse more than to mystify. One suspects an audience. This," he tapped the folded copy of the note resting in his pocket, "was left where it would be found, but by no more than 2 or 3 people at most. Not quite the gesture of a jester, wouldn't you say?" Love muttered something about funny sort of folk and returned to his pudding. The next morning the gossip had swollen further, filling every shop, bus seat, and bar stool in the town. At Carter's tobacconist's the talk was of whether the note suggested an old dispute about bell ownership dating back to medieval times. At the hairdresser's, 2 ladies agreed that it was a coded message between lovers who had quarrelled during choir practice. The librarian, overhearing both versions, gravely informed her assistant that she had always suspected the bell tower of harbouring improper meetings. Canon Parkington, meanwhile, had adopted a wounded dignity. He had declared during morning prayers that St. Swithin's bell had fallen silent through malicious intent, and that such affronts would not deter the parish from its righteous duties. This sermon, unfortunately overheard by a representative of the Flaxborough Citizen, produced a headline that afternoon: "Sacred Bell. Mystery. Church silenced by unknown hand." The Citizen's journalist, a young man eager for drama but ill-supplied with facts, embroidered liberally. "A sinister message," he wrote, "has cast a shadow over Flaxborough's ancient church. The identity of the writer remains unknown, though speculation is rife that enemies of the parish may be at work." When Purbright read this article at his desk, he sighed. He had been content to let the matter rest as a minor curiosity, but the newspaper had elevated it to a public disturbance. A meeting with the canon seemed inevitable. That afternoon Purbright and Sergeant Love called at the vicarage. Parkington received them in a study crowded with theological texts and several unwatered plants. He held out the offending note as though it were radioactive. "You see, Inspector, the implications are quite plain," he said. "Someone objects to our ringing the bell. Not on grounds of noise. Oh, I know the complaints that arise during early practice sessions, but on grounds of ownership. It is not yours to ring. That, I take it, is a challenge to the authority of the church. Possibly, Purbright replied mildly. Or perhaps it is simply someone who dislikes bells. Parkington seemed scandalized by the suggestion. Dislikes? No, I cannot accept that. The bell is integral to our worship. To dislike it is to dislike worship itself. Purbright, whose own view of bells was neutral at best, refrained from comment. Instead, he asked whether the canon could think of anyone, parishioner, rival clergyman, or otherwise, who had expressed particular hostility. The canon frowned, stroking his thin hair. There is, I suppose, Mr. Varney. He lives in that large house on the green, near enough to hear our bell quite distinctly. He has complained once or twice of its volume, but Mr. Varney is not the type to pin notes. Not the type? Asked Purbright, with mild curiosity. A man of business, Inspector, blunt, outspoken, not secretive. If he disapproved of anything, he would tell you so directly. Indeed, he has told me so at some length about our evening services. After a little more polite probing, Purbright and Love left, the note once more in the inspector's pocket. On their walk back, Love asked, "Do you think this Varney fellow's our man, sir?" Purbright considered. Mr. Varney may dislike the bell, but a note such as this speaks of a more private animosity, one that finds relief in anonymity. He smiled faintly. No, Sergeant. If Mr. Varney wished the bell silent, he would more likely have brought us a petition, or perhaps the council's solicitor. The sergeant grunted, unconvinced. That evening, as dusk settled over the market square and the pubs began to hum with custom, Purbright took a slow walk past St. Swithin's. The bell rope had been freed and rehung, though the bell itself remained untested. The canon had insisted no attempt should be made until Sunday, lest further insult occur. As Purbright lingered by the churchyard gate, he overheard two women in animated conversation. One was insisting that the note was clearly the work of that organist. Queer fellow, always scribbling, while the other countered that no, it must be the sacristan who had once been denied a raise and never forgot a slight. He did not interrupt them. It was, after all, in such freely exchanged theories that truth occasionally emerged, disguised but intact. When he returned to the station, he found a message waiting. Mr. Peck, the verger, had telephoned in high agitation. Something more had been discovered in the church that evening. It was not another note, nor any damage. Instead, on the cushion where the first message had been found, lay a small brass key. It was old, tarnished, and quite unlabelled. Sergeant Love, peering at it under the office lamp, declared, "That's just some old key that's dropped out of a pocket. Could be anything." But Purbright looked at it with the same quiet attentiveness he had given the note. He turned it once between his fingers and said softly, "No, Sergeant. Whoever left the first message wanted us to hear silence. Whoever left this wishes us to unlock something." And for the first time he felt that the silence of St. Swithin's bell was not merely an inconvenience, but a prelude. The following morning was pale and damp, with a thin mist seeping across the market square and leaving the shop fronts looking faintly blurred, as if viewed through old spectacles. Inspector Purbright, seated at his desk with the brass key laid carefully on a blotter, gave the impression of a man who had no more pressing occupation than the arrangement of his in-tray. In fact, he was reflecting on the curious combination of messages, one written, cryptic and faintly hostile, the other mute but purposeful. He had learned long ago that criminals seldom provided such neatly arranged puzzles. It was the conscientious, respectable citizens of Flaxborough who enjoyed leaving hints. Sergeant Love entered with the kind of bustling eagerness that suggested he had at last unearthed something decisive. In his hand was a sheet of paper smudged by carbon copy ink. Report from the locksmith, sir. He says the key doesn't fit anything he recognizes locally. Not a house, not a safe. He thinks it might be a cabinet key, Victorian by the look of it. Purbright nodded slowly, not appearing disappointed. Ah, cabinets do abound in Flaxborough. Indeed, one wonders whether the town itself is not merely an assortment of locked cupboards, each with a respectable label. Love, unsure whether this was meant to be serious, gave a grunt. Shall we start knocking on doors then, sir? Eventually, Purbright replied. But not just yet. For now, let us visit those most likely to have noticed the silence of the bell, and see what other noises they have been attending to. Their first call was upon Mr. Varney, the businessman whose name the canon had supplied with such reluctant charity. Varney lived in a large Edwardian villa whose garden was dominated by stone lions and a flagpole from which he had on several occasions flown banners of protest against rates, planning permissions and other affronts to his sovereignty. He received them in a smoking jacket that suggested he had never wholly abandoned the Edwardian age himself. "The bell?" he barked when Purbright mentioned it. "Glad to see the back of it. That thing's been battering my ears for years. Sunday mornings, ghastly racket. I told Parkington I'd rather live next door to a poultry farm. At least chickens stop at dusk." "But you didn't object strongly enough to do anything about it yourself?" asked Purbright in his mild way. "Good heavens, no. I've better uses for my time than climbing up bell towers in the dead of night. Besides, I've got no head for heights." He tapped the side of his nose confidentially. "Giddy, Inspector. Doctor says it's my sinuses." Varney's housekeeper confirmed this medical disability with a roll of the eyes, and after a few more civilities, Purbright withdrew, satisfied that Varney's objections had all the subtlety of artillery fire and none of the secrecy that had produced the mysterious note. Their next visit was to the organist, a thin, nervous man named Priest, who lived above a stationer's shop. He ushered them in with a fluttering anxiety that suggested he feared they were about to charge him with treason. "The bell?" he echoed faintly, wringing his long hands. "Why, yes, I did hear it was tampered with. Shocking, really. Though I must say I never much cared for the timing of its tolls. Very disruptive to music, you know. A bell has no sense of tempo." Purbright allowed him to expound on this theme for several minutes, during which it became apparent that Priest resented the bell for daring to compete with his own organ voluntaries. Yet the resentment was of the pale, perpetual sort, a low, whining note rather than the sharp, decisive strike that produced anonymous warnings. "Do you keep cabinets here, Mr. Priest?" Purbright asked casually, as his eyes wandered across the cramped little sitting room. "Cabinets? Oh yes, several. For music, of course. Scores, hymnals. Why do you ask?" Purbright smiled benignly. "Only that an old key has come into our possession, and I wondered whether it might be of use to you." Priest gazed at the tarnished brass object with fascinated dread, as though it might open not a cabinet, but a coffin. "No, Inspector, not mine. I have all my keys. I make a point of it. To lose a key is to lose order." With that oddly revealing remark, they left him. By mid-afternoon, Purbright and Love had also interviewed Mrs. Gloss, whose dramatic theories about schisms and cults remained undiminished, and Mr. Peck, the verger, who insisted that any act against the bell was a direct attack upon his dignity. None, however, could provide any connection to the key. Back at the station, Love expressed a growing irritation. "We're chasing shadows, sir. A note anyone might have written, a key that could fit any lock. Why, for all we know, someone just dropped it during evensong." Purbright did not immediately reply. He had placed the note and the key side by side on his desk, and was contemplating them as though they were chess pieces. After a long silence, he said, When people wish to threaten, they usually employ the language of fear. This note does not. It speaks of ownership. Not yours to ring. The author claims a right. And this key, well, keys are instruments of possession, are they not? They separate the rightful user from the intruder. Love looked skeptical. You mean someone thinks the bell belongs to them? Purbright's eyes twinkled briefly. Or perhaps to someone else long gone. The past has a habit of laying claims, Sergeant, especially in towns like ours, where history tends to be left in attics until it turns up in awkward places. That evening, he took a solitary stroll through the churchyard once again. The mist had thickened, wrapping the gravestones in damp gauze. He paused near the tower and studied the old stonework. The bell above was a relic, older than most of the town's houses, and likely cast with a dedication to some long-forgotten benefactor. Who, he wondered, might consider that dedication still binding? The thought was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. It was Canon Parkington, carrying a lantern. "Inspector, I did not expect—" Well, I suppose the police must follow their duties wherever they lead. He seemed flustered at finding Purbright alone in the gloom. "I was merely checking the vestry door. We have had thefts in churches elsewhere, you know. Silver, altar cloths. One cannot be too careful." Purbright regarded him mildly. "Quite right, Canon. And yet our intruder leaves gifts rather than taking them away." The Canon blinked. "Gifts?" Purbright held out the key, its brass dull in the lantern glow. "This was found in your pew. It may unlock something within these walls. If you would be so kind as to consider what locks you possess, we might see whether the bell has fallen silent because of the past, not the present." The Canon looked baffled, then uneasy. He muttered something about consulting the churchwardens, bade the inspector good night, and retreated hastily. Purbright watched him go, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. He was not yet sure what the Canon feared, but he was certain that fear existed, and in Flaxborough fear was often the most reliable guide to truth. By the next morning, the mystery of St. Swithin's bell had reached that stage of local gossip in which theories hardened into certainties without ever troubling the realm of evidence. By midday, 3 independent witnesses could swear they had seen strangers prowling near the tower at unholy hours. 2 more insisted they had overheard mutterings about church property in the snug of the King's Head, and one elderly spinster declared that her milk had tasted peculiar ever since the note had been found. This naturally gave Sergeant Love all the fuel he required. By the time he entered Purbright's office, arms full of reports and enthusiasm, he had already constructed a neat solution to the whole affair. "It's the verger, sir, Mr. Peck. All the signs point to him." Purbright, who had been gazing with mild interest at the geraniums drooping outside his window, turned with polite attention. "Do they indeed?" "Yes, sir. He's the one who discovered the note." "He could easily have written it himself, couldn't he?" "Means he gets to stir things up, make himself important. And then there's that key. Who's always hanging about the church, fiddling with cupboards and such like?" "The verger, that's who." "And his motive, Sergeant?" Love looked momentarily deflated, but rallied. "Well, sir, perhaps he wanted to make a point about the Canon. Peck's often grumbling that he doesn't get the respect he deserves. Maybe he thought he'd show the Canon who really runs things." Purbright regarded his sergeant with a faintly indulgent smile. "You paint an interesting picture, Sergeant, but a verger who wishes to elevate his importance usually makes quite a noise about his grievances. Our anonymous correspondent, by contrast, prefers silence. Still, in order not to discourage youthful zeal entirely, Purbright agreed that they should pay Mr. Peck a formal visit. The verger's cottage, tucked behind the churchyard wall, was as orderly as a ledger. Brass gleamed on the hearth, lace antimacassars perched precisely on chairbacks, and the clock on the mantelpiece ticked with a severity that discouraged idle conversation. Mr. Peck himself, stiff in a shiny black suit though the day was warm, received them with a mix of pleasure and outrage. "I am gratified you've come, Inspector," he said, though not surprised. "Matters of discipline and order must be upheld, and I dare say you'll agree that when sacred property is interfered with, it's tantamount to treason. I discovered the note, as I've said, and handed it at once to the canon." A shocking business. Shocking! Purbright allowed him to vent at length before gently producing the key. "This was also discovered in the church. Are you familiar with it, Mr. Peck?" The verger drew himself up. "Certainly not, sir. I am most particular with keys. I keep them all on a ring at my belt, and they do not leave my person. I would never, never permit a stray key to be left lying about. Such laxity is the first step towards burglary." Love, eager to press, asked bluntly, "You didn't write the note yourself, then?" "To draw attention?" Peck's eyes bulged. "Sir, I must protest. That is an insult. I have devoted 35 years to the service of Saint Swithins. To suggest I would dabble in anonymous scribbling, why, it is unthinkable." His indignation seemed genuine, even to Love, who later admitted that a man so offended by disorder would hardly commit an act so disreputable. Leaving the cottage, Purbright strolled slowly back through the churchyard. Love followed, somewhat crestfallen. "Still, sir," he said, "if it wasn't Peck, who else had the chance?" "Many, Sergeant. Keys, after all, exist to make opportunity commonplace. And consider, who benefits if suspicion falls neatly upon a church servant? Why, only those who wish the real quarrel to remain hidden." Love, unaccustomed to riddles before luncheon, gave up with a grunt. By the afternoon, however, the Peck theory had already escaped into the town. Someone who had overheard Love's questions at the cottage told Mrs. Gloss, who told 3 acquaintances, who in turn told the grocer, who told the editor of the Citizen. By tea-time, the public mind had all but convicted the verger, Bell plot suspect, church official. Questioned announced the evening paper over a solemn photograph of Mr. Peck standing by the lich gate, looking bewildered. Canon Parkington was furious. He called upon Purbright at once, waving the newspaper like a flag of war. "Inspector, this is intolerable. Mr. Peck is a devoted servant of the church. To besmirch him so, well, I cannot imagine the harm it may do to morale. Why, the guild is already in uproar." Purbright listened politely, offered a soothing word about lines of inquiry, and refrained from adding that the police themselves had made no public statement. Newspapers in Flaxborough had a curious knack of printing more certainty than the facts could bear. That evening, when he walked home through the square, Purbright noticed a small knot of townsfolk gathered outside the tobacconist's, debating animatedly about the bell. Some sided with the verger, others declared him guilty as sin. One man suggested the whole thing was a conspiracy to raise funds for church repairs, while another claimed it was a rehearsal for the coming council elections. Purbright smiled faintly at these theories. He had learned long ago that in Flaxborough, truth was rarely hidden by silence alone. It was usually buried beneath a comforting blanket of speculation. Back at his house, as he poured himself a modest glass of beer, he reflected on the day. Sergeant Love's tidy solution had its attractions, but the inspector found himself drawn instead to the key, mute, awkward, and suggestive of some claim not yet voiced. "Not yours to ring," the note had said. A grievance of ownership, not of noise or mischief. And keys, after all, belonged to owners. Somewhere in the neat, fussy world of Flaxborough lay a lock that would explain everything. For now, however, the town had its suspect, the gossip had its fuel, and Inspector Purbright had the patient satisfaction of knowing that the obvious was rarely correct. The following Sunday arrived with an air of cautious anticipation. Parishioners gathered for morning service with the mixture of piety and nosiness that had always characterized St. Swithin's congregation. Canon Parkington, resplendent in his vestments, had decreed that the bell should be rung again, to prove, as he put it, that the parish bowed to no idle scribbler's malice. Yet when Mr. Peck pulled the rope, the bell gave forth a dull, uncertain note, not silence, not music, merely a half-hearted clang, as if reluctant to be woken. A few more pulls produced only a wheezing resonance, mournful and short-lived. Murmurs spread quickly among the pews. "Out of tune," whispered one lady. "Not possible," retorted her neighbour. "It's a bell, not a piano." The canon, red-faced but determined, pressed on with the service, though his sermon on steadfastness sounded oddly defensive. The congregation filed out afterwards, buzzing with speculation. Some said the bell had been cursed, others that it had cracked, others still that sabotage was afoot. Inspector Purbright, who had quietly attended at the back, lingered by the porch. He noticed that while most parishioners were full of chatter, one man departed in silence, Mr. Priest, the organist. His thin face was pinched, his eyes darting about as if afraid of being observed. Purbright watched him cross the square and vanish down the side street toward his lodgings. It was then that the inspector's attention was caught by something trifling yet curious, the notice board beside the church door. Among the usual cards advertising jumble sales and Mothers' Union teas was a freshly pinned slip of paper. It was not a note of threat or claim this time, but an announcement for a forthcoming concert at the town hall. The oddity lay in the pin. Unlike the usual brass drawing pins that littered the board, this one was an old-fashioned steel tack, slightly rusted, pressed firmly into the wood. Purbright leaned closer. The tack was bent at an angle, as though hammered in with unnecessary force. It was, he reflected, a very small thing. But then small things often had large connections in Flaxborough. Later that afternoon, back at the police station, Sergeant Love dismissed the matter with his usual bluntness. "A bent pin, sir? We can't go chasing every tack in the town. Someone probably found it in their pocket and used it." "Indeed," Purbright agreed mildly. "But one wonders what sort of person carries a rusty tack in their pocket, and why they should feel compelled to use it rather than a perfectly good pin from the vestry drawer." Love sniffed, unconvinced. The inspector turned instead to the problem of the bell itself. A cracked bell was not beyond possibility. Such things occurred, though rarely without a dramatic clanging finale. Yet Mr. Peck insisted he had heard nothing of the kind. Nor had any local child confessed to climbing the tower, which was the sort of exploit they normally bragged about within hours. The following morning, Purbright arranged a discreet visit to the tower. Mr. Peck, mollified by the inspector's earlier courtesy, led him up the winding stairs. Dust and pigeon feathers lay thick, and the air smelled of age. When they reached the bell chamber, Purbright studied the great bronze instrument closely. It bore an inscription, "To the glory of God," and in grateful memory of Alderman Horace G. Duddleswell, 1883. The letters were deeply cast, though worn at the edges. Purbright ran his hand lightly across them. "No crack here," muttered Peck, with the relief of a man defending his honour. "Sound as the day it was hung." But Purbright's eyes had settled on a different detail. At the base of the bell, where the clapper met the rim, someone had daubed a smear of some dark substance. It was sticky, tar-like, applied crudely with a finger or cloth. "And what, Mr. Peck, do you suppose this is?" The verger bent down, peered and sniffed. "Pitch, by the smell of it. Someone's been smearing pitch on the bell. Why, it's sacrilege." The inspector examined it calmly. "Not sacrilege, Mr. Peck. Sabotage. Someone wishes your bell to ring, but not clearly. They prefer its voice muted, its note spoiled. A most particular intention." Peck, spluttering with indignation, vowed to report the matter to the canon at once. Purbright, however, remained thoughtful. It was not merely a question of silencing the bell. Someone had wished to distort its tone, to make its message uncertain. Later, over tea with Sergeant Love, he shared his discovery. Love reacted with predictable directness. "Well, that proves it, sir. If Peck didn't do it, then it must be one of the choir lot. That organist fellow's shifty. Always looks like he's hiding something. I'd wager he keeps pitch in his pockets." Purbright smiled faintly. "And perhaps rusty tacks as well. It would make his coat rather uncomfortable." Love frowned, puzzled. "You're thinking about that pin again, sir?" "Only that it does not quite belong," said Purbright. "Much like our note, much like our key. In Flaxborough, Sergeant, it is often the misplaced detail that tells us most. When everything appears respectable, it is the odd little trespass, a word, a tack, a smear of tar, that leads to the truth." That evening, as dusk fell over the square, Purbright walked once more past the vicarage. Canon Parkington was visible through the window, dining alone in solemn dignity. Across the street, Mrs. Gloss was busy relating to a neighbour that foreign saboteurs were surely behind the bell's failing note. The inspector paused at the church gate. The bell above was silent, as though sulking. He thought again of the key, of the note, of the bent tack, of the smear of pitch. Each was trivial in itself, yet together they whispered of purpose. Someone in Flaxborough was not merely mischievous nor even malicious, but determined. He let himself smile in the dusk. A mystery of ownership, of silence, of muted voices. And in such matters, he knew, truth would emerge not with a clang, but with the faintest of tinkles. By Monday morning, the bell affair had matured like a wheel of Stilton into a ripe subject for general consumption. Flaxborough had tired of merely repeating the facts. It was time for each citizen to embroider them with personal grievances. At the Corn Exchange, the weekly meeting of the Town Improvement Committee was well underway when the bell entered discussion. Ostensibly gathered to debate parking meters, the councillors soon found themselves arguing over ecclesiastical acoustics. Councillor Harcourt, who prided himself on being the voice of reason, declared that the bell was a public nuisance when functioning and a public scandal when not. Councillor Miss Perks, whose entire career had been built on the suppression of Sunday amusements, retorted that silencing it was an act of godless conspiracy. The chairman called for order, which in Flaxborough meant only that the volume of indignation dipped for a minute before resuming at a higher pitch. The debate produced no resolution except that everyone left in firmer possession of their prejudices. Inspector Purbright, who had been invited as an observer, watched with placid interest. His attention was particularly drawn to one councillor who remained curiously quiet. Alderman Hibble, a portly man whose reputation for thrift bordered on the pathological. Hibble merely stroked his moustache and gazed into the distance while others wrangled. Yet when the meeting ended, he lingered by the doorway to exchange a few murmured words with Councillor Harcourt, who nodded vigorously. Sergeant Love, who had sat beside Purbright throughout, muttered as they left, "Lot of fuss about nothing, sir. Still, did you notice old Hibble, sitting like a fat cat waiting for the cream, didn't say a word until the end?" "I did notice," said Purbright, mild as ever. It is often instructive to observe who is content to let others quarrel on their behalf. Their inquiries next took them to the High Street. Here they called upon Mrs. Trove, proprietress of the ironmongery, who had once been churchwarden before a falling out with Canon Parkington over the use of artificial flowers in the sanctuary. She greeted them with a briskness that suggested long-nursed injury. "The bell? I always said it was too loud. Startles the hens. Not that Parkington cared. He only listens to his guild ladies. But mark my words, Inspector, that bell will bring the roof down one day. Cracks the mortar. I've seen it." Purbright nodded gravely, asked a few polite questions, and left with the impression that Mrs. Trove could sabotage a cathedral if sufficiently provoked. Yet she seemed more interested in proving right about her predictions than in smearing pitch. The afternoon produced further characters. Mr. Codd, landlord of the King's Head, declared that the bell was essential for trade psychology, since Sunday drinkers required a signal to finish their last pint. Miss Blee, the librarian, insisted that bells disturbed serious readers, and wondered aloud whether a silent church might not be more conducive to moral reflection. Old Mr. Scroggins, who swept the marketplace, claimed to have heard footsteps in the churchyard at midnight, though he admitted they might have been his own, returning from the pub. Each encounter added more voices, more rivalries, more quiet feuds to the tapestry. Yet none provided a clear hand behind the pitch or the key. It was in the late afternoon, while returning through the square, that Purbright's eye was caught by a curious little scene outside the post office. Mrs. Gloss, naturally at the centre of it, was addressing three companions in her emphatic whisper. In her hand she flourished an old ledger book, battered and stained. "This proves it," she declared. "I found it in a box at the jumble sale. Look, church accounts from 1883, the very year that Bell was hung. And what do we find? A discrepancy of 4 shillings and 6pence. Embezzlement, I tell you. That Bell was ill-gotten from the start." Her audience gasped appreciatively. One murmured that perhaps the anonymous note was the voice of an injured family reclaiming what was once stolen. Another speculated that the key must unlock some secret compartment in the tower. Purbright, pausing just long enough to glimpse the ledger, said nothing. But later, in his office, he considered the matter carefully. Mrs. Gloss's discovery was typical of Flaxborough, trifling in substance, dramatic in effect. Yet the notion of an old wrong carried forward into the present did not wholly displease him. That evening he called at the vicarage. Canon Parkington received him with weary dignity. "Inspector, I really must protest. My congregation is in ferment. People mutter about conspiracies, curses, and scandals from the last century. It is most unhelpful." "History," Purbright observed gently, "is often unhelpful, Canon, especially when it lingers unpaid." The Canon frowned. "I assure you, our parish accounts are in perfect order. I cannot be expected to answer for the finances of my predecessors." Purbright inclined his head. "Of course not. Yet one cannot help wondering whether someone else feels they can." As he walked back through the darkened streets, the inspector reflected on the day's encounters. Each character had contributed a thread: grievances, suspicions, rivalries. The bell was not merely an instrument of sound, it was a mirror for the town's resentments. Everyone had a reason to silence it, or to claim it, or to denounce it. But still the details tugged at him. The note asserting ownership. The key promising access. The tack oddly out of place. And the smear of pitch ensuring the bell spoke not clearly but in a spoiled, uncertain voice. Taken together, they suggested not a prank, not mere mischief, but a deliberate act of commentary. Someone in Flaxborough wished to remind the town that its history was not so neatly respectable as it liked to believe. And in the inspector's experience, such reminders were never offered without a personal stake. For the first time, he wondered whether the crime was not against the church at all, but against the comfortable silence that Flaxborough cherished. Tuesday morning began with drizzle that flattened the geraniums outside the police station and lent Flaxborough's stone facades the mournful air of washed-out theatre scenery. Inspector Purbright, nursing his first cup of tea, was interrupted by Sergeant Love's entry. "Bit of a flap at the church again, sir. Canon Parkington telephoned. Says there's been another—" Well, he wouldn't quite call it outrage, but he sounded near to tears. Within half an hour, they were at St. Saviour's. The drizzle had thickened into a damp mist, softening the edges of gravestones and tower. Inside the porch stood the canon, pale and anxious, twisting his hands like a man trying to wring water from his own fingers. "It is intolerable, Inspector. Look!" He led them into the nave, the great bell rope, which descended in a neat coil. Beside the font was hanging in frayed ruin. The lower length had been slashed away as though with a sharp blade, leaving strands dangling like severed nerves. At the base lay a heap of rough fibres, muddied and trampled. Love bent to examine them. "Clean cut, sir. Knife, I'd say. Not very old either. Still smells of hemp." Purbright regarded the sight without visible emotion. "I take it, Canon, that you have not rung the bell since Sunday?" "No, Inspector. I had rather thought silence the better part of discretion until your inquiries were complete. Imagine my horror this morning when Mrs. Treadgold, our verger's widow, came to prepare the flowers and discovered this desecration." The word desecration echoed gloomily under the rafters, and Purbright allowed a moment for it to subside. Then he asked, "Were the doors locked last night?" "As always." "Only I, the verger's widow, and Mr. Harcourt, our churchwarden, have keys, and I assure you, Inspector, none of us would dream of—" He broke off, reddening with indignation. Purbright inclined his head mildly. "It is often better not to conclude sentences in anger, Canon. One finds oneself obliged to qualify them later." They examined the locks, no sign of tampering. The vestry door, too, was secure, yet the cut rope spoke of determined intrusion. By late morning, news had spread like rising damp. Outside the churchyard gate gathered knots of townsfolk, all eager to provide explanations. Mrs. Gloss was, of course, in the thick of it, pronouncing in oracular tones that the severed rope was a sign of final judgment. Beside her, old Scroggins muttered darkly that he had indeed heard footsteps again in the night. "And this time I weren't drunk." Alderman Hibble arrived puffing from the High Street, declared the outrage an insult to municipal dignity, and hinted loudly that certain clerical extravagances were bound to invite retribution. His remarks drew sharp retorts from Councillor Miss Perks, who accused him of profiting from ungodliness. The crowd lapped it up like children at a Punch and Judy show. Meanwhile, Purbright and Love retired to the vestry, where the inspector considered the matter in his steady, owlish way. "We are faced with progression, Love. First, the bell silenced with pitch. An ambiguous act, muffling but not destroying. Then a note asserting ownership. Next a key. Now the rope itself removed. Each step increases the severity." Love frowned. "It's almost like someone's writing a play, sir. Each scene a bit louder than the last." "Precisely." Purbright stroked his chin. "And the stage, I fear, is our church." They decided upon a quiet canvass of the houses adjoining the churchyard. At the grocer's on Cloister Lane, Mrs. Bray reported seeing a lantern light through the mist at about 11 the previous night. Moving slow-like, could have been the sexton, but then again, he's dead. She crossed herself unnecessarily. Next door, Mr. Pollitt, a retired clerk, insisted he had heard a queer dragging noise after midnight. When pressed, he admitted it might have been his cat scratching the scullery door. Only at the little cobbler's workshop, did they glean something more substantial? Mr. Datchery, bent double over a half-soled boot, remarked that he had been woken by voices near the lich gate. Two men speaking low. One had a harsh laugh, like a crow choking. He could not see them in the mist, but he was certain of the sound. Back at the station, Purbright set down the statements in his neat hand. A lantern, a dragging noise, two men's voices. It was not much, but it began to sketch an outline. That evening Flaxborough buzzed with rumour. Some swore the rope had been stolen to make a noose, others that it was needed for black magic rites. Mrs. Gloss confided to her circle that the ledger she had found proved the church's founders were frauds and that the present vandalism was divine vengeance. By supper-time, half the town had heard the tale and was repeating it with suitable embellishments. Purbright, however, sat in his office with the frayed rope ends laid out before him. He examined them as if they might yield confession. What struck him most was not the cut itself, but the absence of the missing length. Whoever had done this had carried away several feet of hempen cord, a bulky, awkward prize. Why? Love, staring at the evidence, ventured, "Perhaps they wanted a souvenir?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Souvenirs are usually pocket-sized, love. I think our culprit has in mind some further employment for the rope." The inspector leaned back, steepling his fingers. "So far we have silence imposed upon the bell, a claim of ownership, the suggestion of a key, and now the rope gone. What next, I wonder? A bell without a tongue." He gazed at the ceiling, where shadows from the lamp trembled like faint echoes of the absent sound. The pattern was clear enough. Someone was intent on staging a slow, deliberate stripping of the bell's identity. First, its voice, now its means of speech, step by step, an erasure. And somewhere in Flaxborough, two men with a lantern, one of them laughing like a crow, carried a coil of stolen rope toward whatever climax they had in mind. By Wednesday afternoon, the drizzle had cleared, leaving Flaxborough washed and bright, though the freshness of the air did little to calm the town's fevered speculation. The mutilated bell rope had become the sole subject of conversation, from the fishmonger's slab to the snug of the Black Swan. Every theory had its adherents, from spectral vengeance to municipal conspiracy. Inspector Purbright, however, had no taste for conjecture. His interest lay in two men reported loitering by the lich gate, one with a crow-like laugh. A quiet request to Sergeant Love brought results. The sergeant, having spoken to the cobbler once more, thought he could identify the laugh as belonging to a certain Joe Crake, a petty thief and sometime docker who had lately drifted back into town. "Crake, sir," Love explained as they walked across the market square, "is what my mum used to call a wrong 'un. He's been in and out of trouble since his school days. Pinched a motorbike once, drove it clean into the canal. Last I heard, he was working casual shifts at the brewery." Purbright nodded, his interest mild but steady. "And his companion?" "Not certain." The cobbler reckoned the other voice was softer, local, could be Crake's cousin, Billy Goff. The pair of them used to be thick as thieves, literally. They found Crake at the brewery yard, leaning against a stack of barrels and smoking with studied insolence. A lean man with a nose sharp as a billhook, he greeted the inspector's questions with a grin that indeed resembled the choke of a crow. "Bell rope, sir?" "Can't say I know what you mean. I've no call to meddle in churches. I prefer my evenings lively, not godly." He spat a shred of tobacco onto the cobbles. Purbright watched him calmly. "Mr. Crake, you were observed near St. Saviour's Lich Gate 2 nights ago, with another man. If you value your freedom, you will tell us precisely what business detained you there." Crake's grin faltered. for the briefest second before returning. "Talking rubbish, Inspector. I weren't anywhere near the place. I was here, shifting casks till midnight." "Indeed? Then I shall trouble the foreman for confirmation." Purbright's tone was mild, but the edge was steel. As they turned away, Love murmured, "He's rattled, sir?" I could see it. "Quite. Rattled birds are often quickest to fly. We must watch where this one goes." They did not wait long for development. That evening, word reached the station that Craik and another man had been seen drinking heavily at the Black Swan, boasting of having the town in a proper flap. Purbright and Love went at once. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with pipe smoke and cheap beer. In a shadowed corner sat Craik and his companion, a burly fellow with a cauliflower ear, Billy Goff. They were laughing, too loudly, as if daring the world to challenge them. On the table between them lay a coil of rough hemp rope, unmistakable even under the fug. Love's eyes widened. "That's it, sir." "Patience, Love. Let us allow the play to advance a line or two." They ordered ale and settled nearby, half obscured by a pillar. Craik was in full spate, thumping the table with glee. "Told you, didn't I? Cut it clean as butter, and the old fool'll be scratching his cassock, wondering who's robbed his holy twine. Next we'll—" Goff hushed him with a glance, but Craik only laughed louder, the sound like a rusty hinge. Purbright leaned toward Love. "You will observe, Sergeant, that criminals often prefer boasting to discretion. One day, criminologists will classify it as a disease." Their opportunity came when the landlord, uneasy at the talk, carried the coil of rope to the bar, muttering that he would not have church property flaunted on his premises. The two men protested, but the landlord was firm. Purbright rose then, and with quiet authority claimed the rope as evidence. Craik attempted a show of bravado. "You've no proof it's church rope, Inspector." Purbright's gaze was steady. "Proof is a luxury, Mr. Craik. What I require at present is explanation." The swagger faltered. Goff, sensing danger, muttered something about just a bit of fun, and made to leave. Love intercepted him smartly, blocking the way with a policeman's bulk. At the station, under questioning, their stories wavered. Goff insisted they had found the rope discarded near the churchyard wall. Craik claimed they had cut it simply for sport, to annoy the canon. Neither could explain the presence of lantern light, nor why voices had been heard plotting. Purbright listened without interruption, then quietly observed, "Men seldom risk imprisonment for sport, and lanterns are heavy companions for mischief. I think we must assume you had purpose in mind." When pressed further, both clammed up, surly and tight-lipped. The inspector, not wishing to push them prematurely into silence, dismissed them with a warning, but kept the rope in evidence. Later, alone with Love, he reflected. They are involved, certainly, but not, I think, as principals. Their actions are those of men hired or enticed to perform crudities. The true author of our drama, Love, remains behind the curtain. Love frowned. So Craik and Goff were just the stagehands? Precisely. And the play's director, whoever claims the bell as his own, is not yet revealed, but he grows bolder. That night, as Flaxborough slept, the soundless tower of St. Saviour's loomed against the moonlit sky. Inside, the mutilated bell hung mute, its severed rope replaced only by shadows. But in Purbright's mind, the crime no longer resembled mischief, it was orchestration. Deliberate, calculated, with actors placed upon the stage. And somewhere the following morning began with a curious stillness in Flaxborough, the sort of quiet that was less restful than expectant. The mutilated bell rope remained locked in the station's evidence cupboard, yet its absence from St. Saviour's Tower had already infected the parish with a sense of deprivation. It was as if the church itself were holding its breath. Inspector Purbright felt that same tension while making his way across the marketplace. He carried with him the small leather-bound ledger Mrs. Gloss had surrendered 2 days earlier, its cracked spine now firmly stitched with significance in his mind. Until then, he had treated the book as a curiosity, a jumble of figures and names, faintly ecclesiastical, faintly municipal. But the mutilation of the Eats bell rope had transformed it into something more, a motive, perhaps even a map. Back in his office, he spread the ledger on the desk. Love, summoned from the outer room, hovered eagerly. "Notice here, Love," Purbright said, tapping a finger against a page headed Collections 1951. Parishioners' donations, pew rents, burial fees, quite usual. But then look at this column. Love squinted. Special allowance Canon R. Precisely. Each month, a sum recorded against that name. Not trifling either. The equivalent of a curate's stipend, siphoned with monotonous regularity. A note further down, entries marked with a discreet cross. Amounts received, yet unaccounted for, in the parish books. Love frowned. "You think Canon Dobson's been pocketing funds, sir?" Purbright leaned back. "I think, Sergeant, that someone believed he had, and someone took great pains to hide or to preserve the record. Our mutilated rope may well be linked not to sacrilege but to bookkeeping." They were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Gloss herself, clutching a parcel of papers. She looked both flustered and triumphant. "Inspector, forgive me, but I thought you should see these at once. I discovered them last night in the vestry safe, tucked behind a loose panel. More ledgers, some older, some newer. And look, they match the hand in the book you already have." Purbright leafed through them carefully. The same looping script, the same peculiar abbreviations, and in each the same pattern of questionable entries. Love whistled. "It's a whole system, sir. Money trickling off to somewhere month after month, but where?" "Ah," said Purbright softly. "That is our bell ringer, so to speak. The silent force behind the rope's severing." The inspector took the bundle to the town hall archives. There, after some tactful persuasion of a clerk with thick spectacles, he compared the figures with borough accounts. The trail was faint but discernible. Funds drawn from parish collections had been funneled into what appeared to be a restoration fund for church property. Yet cross-checked with town records, no such restorations had occurred. Love muttered, "So it's theft, plain and simple." Purbright smiled faintly. "Theft, yes, but not plain. It is systematic, careful, designed to escape notice, until someone, perhaps embittered or ambitious, sought to make it heard by silencing the bell, symbol against symbol. As if to confirm his reasoning, a note awaited him at the station upon his return. The canon requested his presence at St. Saviour's with utmost urgency. When Purbright and Love arrived, they found Dobson pale and trembling in the vestry. Spread on the table were anonymous letters scrawled in block capitals, "Restore what you have taken, or the church will fall silent forever." Love's eyes widened. "Well, that settles it." Purbright examined the paper. The handwriting was clumsy, but the phrasing theatrical. "Not the work of Craik or Goff," he mused. "They lack the imagination. This comes from a hand more deliberate, more intent on drama than drunken jest." The canon, wringing his hands, protested his innocence. "I have never stolen a farthing. If moneys were mislaid, it was through error or through the negligence of others. Inspector, you must believe me." Purbright inclined his head politely, but said nothing. Outside, in the graveyard, Love voiced his unease. "Do you believe him, sir?" Belief, love, is a luxury for Sundays. For weekdays we must be content with evidence, and evidence, so far, speaks less of innocence than of concealment. That evening, Purbright sat alone at his desk, studying the ledgers by lamplight. Each page seemed to whisper of transactions shaded just enough to escape scrutiny. And through it all, he saw the hand of an author, someone who had preserved these books, who had perhaps spirited them from the vestry and placed them in Mrs. Gloss's path. Was it a parishioner scandalized into vigilante exposure? Was it one of the canon's fellow clergy coveting his position? Or was it someone beyond the church walls, with a stake in keeping the bells silenced? As midnight approached, Purbright closed the ledger. The threads of money, rope, and silence were converging into one fabric, a tapestry of fraud, resentment, and calculated menace. Somewhere in Flaxborough, the true hand waited, watching. The bell might be silent, but the investigation had only just begun to sound. Owen, the true dramatist, sharpened his pen for the next act. The following week dawned with a sullen drizzle that left Flaxborough's pavement slick, and its shopkeepers inclined to glower at every potential customer as if rain itself were a conspiracy. Inspector Purbright, however, had no leisure to reflect upon the town's commercial dampness. An urgent call from the canon's house had arrived at the police station just after 8 o'clock, conveyed in the shrill tones of Mrs. Dobson, whose gift for hysteria exceeded her husband's skill at homily. When Purbright and Sergeant Love arrived, they found Canon Dobson in his study, seated rigidly in an armchair, his cassock creased like crumpled paper. A tumbler of brandy trembled in his hand. Across his desk lay a letter, its envelope still wet from the rain where the postman had thrust it through the brass flap. "Another," Dobson whispered hoarsely, thrusting it forward. Purbright took the sheet. The same block capitals as before, though the words now bore an edge, sharpened with menace. "Confess to the town or the soundless bell will claim you next." Love muttered, "They've gone from church furniture to personal threats." Dobson's eyes darted. "Inspector, you must protect me. Someone, some lunatic, is determined to destroy my reputation. You know I am blameless." Purbright, with customary gentleness, asked, "Canon, may I inquire whether your household received any visitors last night?" The canon hesitated, then admitted that his verger, Mr. Craik, had called late with a message about hymn sheets. "I thought it curious," Dobson said. He seemed less tipsy than usual, almost purposeful. Before Purbright could pursue this, Mrs. Dobson swept into the room with a tray of tea, scolding her husband for parading misery before the police like some spiritual invalid. She thrust cups upon them with rattling precision. Purbright, long accustomed to Mrs. Dobson's style, accepted graciously. Back at the station, he summoned Craik. The verger arrived smelling faintly of gin, but sober enough to appear indignant. "Me? Threatening the canon? Sir, I've rung his bell for 20 years, never laid a finger on his post." "You visited him last night," Purbright observed mildly. Craik blinked. "That were only hymn sheets, like he said. He keeps forgetting them, so I takes them round. That's all. Besides, Inspector, if I wanted to do him in, I'd hardly go sober, would I?" Love coughed discreetly, but made no comment. The day wore on with little progress until, near dusk, an alarm came from St. Saviour's. A parishioner, arriving for choir practice, had discovered the canon collapsed in the vestry, gasping for breath. Purbright and Love hurried there to find Dobson propped against the communion rail, attended by a frantic Mrs. Gloss and a fluttering curate. The canon's lips were tinged blue, and his chest heaved. Beside him lay a teacup, overturned, its contents soaking into the rug. Purbright sniffed the air. Bitter almonds. "Fetch a doctor," he said quietly. "At once." The doctor arrived swiftly and confirmed what Purbright suspected, an attempt at poisoning. The canon had ingested a small dose of cyanide, not fatal in the diluted state, but sufficient to induce shock. Mrs. Dobson wailed. Mrs. Gloss wrung her hands. The curate muttered about evil stalking the parish. Purbright, meanwhile, regarded the cup. It was one of a mismatched set, often used in the vestry for hurried refreshments. Whoever had tampered with it had chosen their opportunity carefully, knowing the canon would drink before choir practice, knowing too that the vestry's comings and goings left little chance of certainty. Later that night, when Dobson was resting under medical supervision, Purbright and Love sat in the station office. "This is no longer symbolic," Purbright said quietly. "The rope was a gesture, the letters a warning. Now we have an attempt upon the man himself." Love, grim for once, replied, "So it's someone with more than a grudge, someone with something to lose." Purbright tapped the ledger lying open before them. "Indeed, these accounts hold secrets dangerous enough to inspire fear, perhaps ruin. Whoever wrote those letters believed silence was safer. But tonight's act shows desperation. We are no longer dealing with mere indignation, but with the instinct for self-preservation." He closed the book gently, as though reluctant to disturb its sleeping numbers. "We must therefore consider, Love, not merely who dislikes Canon Dobson, but who most dreads what he might reveal." The drizzle had thickened into steady rain outside, blurring the street lamps and deepening the hush in Flaxborough. Somewhere in that quiet town a hand had measured out poison into a vestry teacup. Purbright, folding his hands, knew that the bell without sound was about to toll its loudest. The drizzle that had dampened Flaxborough for a week gave way, by some uncharacteristic mercy, to a brisk, dry morning. Inspector Purbright, arriving at St. Saviour's Parish Hall for a scheduled informal gathering, thought it a suitable day for finalities. The canon, pale but upright, had agreed to preside as though nothing untoward had occurred. Around the table sat the cast of Flaxborough's ecclesiastical drama, Mrs. Gloss, resplendent in an aggressively floral hat, Mr. Craik, wearing an expression of martyrdom, the curate, fidgeting with his collar, and Mrs. Dobson, stiff as carved alabaster, determined to project fortitude. Purbright, polite as ever, began without flourish. "Thank you for assembling. I thought it helpful if we all met to clarify recent disturbances concerning St. Saviour's." The curate blurted. It was diabolical intervention, only to be hushed by Mrs. Dobson. Purbright smiled faintly. "Not quite, Mr. Treadgold. The matter is sadly human." He laid before them a small folder of papers. "The letters, the rope, and most lately, the incident in the vestry. They form a pattern, one not of spiritual menace, but of worldly anxiety. Each sought to silence Canon Dobson. The bell without sound, if you will." The canon twitched. Mrs. Gloss leaned forward avidly. Purbright continued in his quiet cadence. "The key lies in those parish accounts. Most people found them dull, even unintelligible, but to a certain eye they revealed curious transactions, payments routed through fictitious suppliers, a siphoning of funds." Craik gave a bark of laughter. "Then it's Dobson what's guilty. He signs the cheques." Purbright regarded him mildly. "Indeed, Canon Dobson signed what was placed before him, but the handwriting in the ledgers, the convenient adjustments, the invented names, was not his. It was that of Mrs. Gloss." The parish treasurer froze. A tremor passed through her flowered hat. "That is preposterous." "Not at all," Purbright said gently. "You had both the authority and the opportunity. You alone prepared the accounts. And when Canon Dobson, in his dutiful but belated perusal, began to make inquiries, you saw danger. The first letter was to frighten him into silence. The second, more desperate. The rope across the belfry, a theatrical warning, but when he persisted, you resorted to poison in the vestry. Mrs. Gloss opened her mouth, closed it, then snapped, "If he had kept to his sermons instead of meddling in matters beyond him." Mrs. Dobson rose, stiff with indignation. "You wicked, wicked woman!" Purbright raised a hand. "Let us not forget Mrs. Gloss did not intend death. The dose was small, sufficient to alarm, but not to kill. Yet the intent was criminal all the same." The treasurer sagged, her defiance spent. "I never wanted to harm him. I only wanted time to put the account straight. I borrowed, that's all. The bingo takings, the flower show funds, it was meant to be temporary, but it mounted. And when he asked questions, I panicked." A silence settled, broken only by the tick of the parish hall clock. At length, Purbright rose. "Mrs. Gloss, I shall have to ask you to accompany me to the station. Matters will proceed with discretion. I think the magistrates will appreciate your candour." She nodded weakly, removing her hat as though in token of surrender. Later that day, after the necessary statements had been taken and Mrs. Gloss formally charged, Purbright returned to his office. Sergeant Love hovered by the filing cabinet, looking both triumphant and puzzled. "Funny thing, sir," Love said, "all that fuss over a few missing pounds. You'd think she was covering up something grander." Purbright settled at his desk, smoothing his papers. To Mrs. Gloss, it was grand enough. Respectability is a fragile possession in Flaxborough. She feared disgrace more keenly than prison. The letters, the rope, even the poison, none were acts of hatred. They were attempts to hold off humiliation. Love shook his head. "Still, she nearly did in the canon." "Quite so," Purbright murmured. "Fear drives stranger courses than malice." Through the window, the rain-scrubbed town resumed its usual rhythm. Tradesmen's vans rumbling, shopgirls darting with parcels, the muted clang of the market clock. Life had folded back into its customary pattern, as though scandal and poison were no more than temporary inconveniences like puddles on cobbles. Purbright, dipping his pen, returned to the paperwork. Outside, St. Saviour's bell remained silent, awaiting repair. Yet in its silence there was a certain appropriateness, a reminder that in Flaxborough noise was seldom necessary for drama to occur.